Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. She kept her hands busy because hands could be conspiring and hands could be honest. In the glow of the restaurant chandeliers, they were both nervous work and practiced calm. Moving plates, pouring wine, tucking a stray curl behind her ear when a patron mistook that motion for flirtation. Lily had learned to make invisible the small betrayals of her face, the way her jaw clenched when a man laughed too loudly about old streets, the way her shoulders climbed when a delivery truck idled outside and the diesel smell seeped in through the service door. She counted napkins like rosary beads and tied herself to the present by the weight of a tray. If you like slow-burn crime romance with quiet tension, stay with this story until the end and consider subscribing for more narratives like this. On the floor that night, the restaurant smelled like lemon oil and butter, the linen crisp under palms that moved quicker than the conversation at the next table. Rain smudged the city lights outside into a watercolor she'd learned to read. Red bleeds where danger waited, yellow where people tried to forget. The Corsetti dining room was a hush of expensive cloth, quiet voices, and the faint, watchful distance of a family that measured people by what they could do and who they were tied to. Lily passed between tables with the practiced soldierliness of someone used to being observed and remaining unreadable. He noticed her in the way dangerous things always notice the small details others let go. Dante Corsetti watched from the corner of a private table, his posture an economy of measures, a coat unbuttoned at the wrist as if to free his hands, eyes that had learned to catalogue risk and kindness with equal speed. He was not the kind to be immediately noticed. He was noticed because careful people made space for him in their calculations. He'd sent his lieutenant for a risotto and asked casually if the server on the third shift was new. That question, like a pinprick, was how families like the Corsettis tested the seams of a city. Lily felt the look like a draft. She kept moving. The tray hummed in her grip. She adjusted the leather strap of the apron that kept a battered bus pass and 2 syllabi pressed against her hip. Her scholarship pin, folded into the lining, was not for showing. She had run 2 years ago, and the practice of running was in the steady set of her shoulders. Defeated hands that had learned to fold themselves into small, unobtrusive shapes. When the dessert plates came back to the pass, Dante rose and crossed to the side where servers waited for instructions. He came behind her without a sound and set a napkin into his palm as if to correct the curve of a fold. For a second, their hands brushed, light, accidental, and there was a current, immediate and quiet, that tested the idea of touch. Lily's instinct was to sign, a single motion she used to steady herself when speech would be unsafe, a quick, private gesture of thanks that meant nothing to the strangers around them. She drew her fingers together and then flattened them, a rhythm she had learned to keep hidden unless with someone who understood. Dante read the motion as someone who had taught himself to read more than faces. He did not ask. He only inclined his head, and later, when the kitchen closed and the chandeliers dimmed, he stood near the door that led to the alley and waited for her. "You're quick," he said. His voice was low and careful. Italian consonants softened by a Chicago accent that had been worn into gentleness. It was not the voice of a man who wanted to be noticed. It was the voice of a man testing whether notice could be held without cost. Lily kept her eyes on the mop bucket. She'd been trained in keeping gaze steady. Training was a different kind of armor than keeping a gun from shaking in your hand. Long shifts make you that, she said. She signed for patience under her breath, just once, the way a person prays, not aloud, but with the hands that have carried bread and grief. He watched her hands. "Do you sign?" he asked. She did not sign back. She did not have to. Her throat tightened as if at a stitch. A little, she admitted. It was the safest truth. The world she had left 2 years before had used silence and sign in ways that changed you. In certain rooms, hands could be loyalty. In others, they were a herald of what you had fled. Dante nodded, small, not as an acceptance, but as a tabulation. "My mother signs," he said. "She says it is a language you can't lie in if you try. It reads you." Lily wanted to smile and then decided against the small betrayal of hope. "She's right," she said. The words were modest. She had learned to hide the larger truths. Her last name, the way her family could be named in the same breath as fear. The O'Malley name had weight. It had cost her evenings, friends, and a plan to study abroad. It had cost her— She did not let herself finish the sentence. Dante's fingers found the rim of a glass and twisted a napkin between them. "Aren't you cold?" he asked. Rain had begun again, and it made the neon outside blur. His question was not about weather. She shrugged. "I'm fine." "Do you want to be?" he asked, as if asking for a favor. He slid a hand into the pocket of his coat and came out with a scarf. Not one of those theatrical gestures, but something quietly practical. He placed it around her neck. The silk smelled faintly of faint pipe smoke and citrus, the smell a small domestic talisman. His fingers lingered for a moment, light, a testing of the idea of touch, and Lily felt something unspool that had been taught since her exit from the O'Malley house 2 years earlier. Someone noticed him watch her later, an assistant manager passing by with a folded memo. Em das quisesses e instruções para a síntese de fala, você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Assistant Manager passing by with a folded memo. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. In the kitchens, gossip is currency, and suspicion its own kind of ledger. He asked about you to the maitre d', the assistant murmured as Lily refolded napkins. Her voice was practical, uninterested in the human calculus of protection and danger. That night, when she clocked out, someone left a single envelope tucked beneath the sleeve of a shirt in the staff locker. Her name was not written on it, but the handwriting, the slanted, decisive loop of an older man, was one she remembered from childhood letters. She took it home and hid it beneath the loose floorboard beneath the stove. The envelope contained a photograph she had thought she'd burned, a picture of the O'Malley family on a summer evening, her father, Patrick O'Malley, flanked by brothers who had younger faces. Her younger brother's grin in the photo made her throat hurt. There was also a note, "We are watching. Be careful." She had run 2 years before because running had been the only language she could use to say no. Her father had not wanted shame in the family ledger, and leaving had been a small, sharp treason. 2 of her siblings had stayed. Their names appeared in the docket of calls she could not answer. Don't call, she told herself. Don't tell, she told herself again. Live small, study hard, graduate, become someone who could cross a street and not have someone call out the name you'd born into as if it were a brand. Instead, someone noticed the name she'd left behind, looking back. Dante noticed more. He noticed the way her fingers found the edge of the locked envelope with a tenderness that was almost claustrophobic. He noticed how she swallowed when the photograph surfaced, how small her laugh became. Protective gestures for someone like him were not always warrior-like. They were small, making sure the security at his family's back door eyed the alley a little longer, asking his Lieutenant Carlo to take an extra walk by the staff entrance, sitting in the restaurant after hours so that when she closed up, she would not be the only soul in that block. "You left something tonight," he said when he slipped his hand between the slats of the side door and found her there. He had taken off his coat, and the kitchen lights cast him in easy gold. It should have felt like theater, a scene from a film, but there was no cinematic grace, only two people measuring how much of themselves they could risk. She did not answer for a long time. When she did, it came in the soft sign she used for apology and for goodbye, two things that in her life often braided together. Signed, "I don't want trouble," she conveyed. That was the translation of every image she had of her family, not wanting trouble, but trouble having a way of choosing you anyway. He sat on the low step and watched her. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "But if trouble comes looking for you, it will have to get through me first." The offer was both a sword and a shield. It mattered less that he meant it in the familial politics that guided men like him. It mattered that he meant it at all. Lily accepted the quiet with something like relief. She did not tell him who had been watching. An older man from the Omeli cruise, she thought, someone with a limp and a closer memory of old debts. But she did let herself be followed home that week by a pair of Corsetti lieutenants who walked 2 blocks behind her and then turned away when they saw her glance back. Days passed, folded into shifts and study hours and the small litany of anonymity. She read syntax books late at night and folded socks in the morning. Dante occasionally showed up at the bar where she worked on the late shift, ordering coffee without milk, or sat in the corner of the garden and watched the roses. His family's garden was the kind of place where roses grew like small, regimented promises, tended and pruned and kept in patterns that suggested control. Once, when he found her sitting on a bench there before the sun rose high, he signed a simple phrase she understood. Signed, "It's okay to be tired." She had signed back then that she had been tired for a long time. It was Mrs. Corsetti who first stepped into the thickness of the story in the way mothers do, slow, patient, insistently practical. She saw the way Lily's hands moved when she refilled the water glasses for a private dinner and signed to her across the table as if across an ocean. "You sign," she said later in the kitchen, crisp in a way that made Lily look up. "Good hands are not made, child. They are remembered." Mrs. Corsetti's interest was personal and political in equal measure. She offered Lily tutoring with language exchange and a place to sit in the estate's library while the summer thunder went on. Her hands were warm, her signing precise and without show. She had the look of someone who had loved in ways that had required courage as much as calculation. In her presence, Lily felt something like permission to breathe. "You have to be careful with your past," Mrs. Corsetti told her once, over tea and a plate of biscotti. The glass window behind them blurred with rain. "But you do not have to be along with it." Alone had been a condition Lily had intentionally cultivated. When she thought of the Omeli dinners, heavy curtains, louder laughter that masked the knives in conversations, she could still taste the olive oil and the ash of someone else's cigarettes. Leaving had been a small theology of survival. Yet what the absence had not given her was the ability to stop being looked for by obligation. Her siblings' names lived like small echoes in her jacket. She loved them, she thought, and that love was a locus of danger. It made her soft where she needed to be hard. Then Flanagan made his move. Sean Flanagan was a man who had learned to translate opportunity into entreaty.
If you show this to the right person, if your father sees this, he has a choice. The lake breathed outside, a long, low sound like something trying to name itself. Lily listened. Her hands trembled as she traced the ink lines. Evidence was a hard currency in a world of loyalty and betrayal. It could be used to leverage, to bargain, to expose, each option a different kind of danger. She had wanted, when she left, to step into a life counted by exams and essays, not into ledgers and threats. Yet here she was, ledger in hand, bargaining for the lives of brothers who still called her by an old nickname. They decided, eventually, to confront Flanagan indirectly, leak a copy of the evidence to one of Flanagan's old allies, someone whose loyalty was to coin more than to conflict, and let the man's greed make him betray his current liege. It was a plan of edges and price tags, and Lily felt each edge as if the ledgers had been a blade. She knew that once she set the plan in motion, the world would tilt, and not necessarily towards safety. The night they set the leak in motion, it rained like someone trying to wash the city clean. Water ran in black rivulets down the highway, and the docks glowed like something out of a different century, lamps washing the barges in white. Dante's men moved like instruments. Carlo at the gate, 2 others for the perimeter, a driver who kept the engine idling because engines are small promises of flight. Lily sat in the car and watched the rain on the windshield, her hands folded over the folder, as if it were her child. Her breath fogged the glass. In the small smear, she saw 2 hands make the sign she used in the restaurant to steady herself, flat and then folded, a silent smoothing. It was an old ritual of survival. She was terrified and determined in equal measure. Terror was a cold river, and resolve the bridge over it. When Dante reached across and took her hand, no sign this time, only contact, the world contracted to the warmth of his grasp. They baited Flanagan successfully. In the week that followed, a smear campaign of rumors and quiet betrayals unspooled. Flanagan ate his own shadow, turning on his lieutenants and offering gifts to old friends to buy their silence. The Amali world, too, shifted. Whispers in the barber shop, a cousin arriving late to a dinner in a coat that did not fit the season. Then came the phone call Lily had feared and hoped would never arrive. Her youngest brother's voice on the line was close to breaking. He said nothing of running away, only that the men in front of his apartment had asked about someone who had left. After the call, Lily could not find any language that sat without scalding. She wanted to run down the lake road and take him away. I wanted to hand the ledger to the nearest policeman and ask for lights and cameras and the law. I wanted to stand in public and say her name aloud and ask for mercy. Instead, she signed to Dante in the car, flat, precise. Get them safe. I will stand in front of the line. He understood. His mouth curved in a manner that held both promise and fear. We will get them safe, he said. We will make them unavailable to Flanagan. What he did not tell her was that this was the line where his family's and her family's histories tangled. The Corsettis had power, but they were not angels. Protecting someone could mean making choices that cost others. In the calculus that guided men like him, sometimes shelter was a currency you paid with something else. They moved quickly after that. A safe extraction for Tommy and the younger siblings was arranged, a temporary place outside the city where a woman Dante trusted ran an old bed and breakfast. The move was quiet, efficient, and clean, the sort of thing Lily had thought only happened in films. Yet every plan of extraction is a map of risk. And somewhere along the edges, a man like Flanagan always thinks he can find the small shadow of fault to exploit. When Tommy left, his face in the window of the van like a snapshot of a boy who had to grow up too quickly, Lily felt a hollowing that was almost physical. They had him on the road, and Dante's team watched the horizon. For once, she allowed herself to hope the ledger had been enough. Then an intercepted message arrived, digital, clipped, and cruel. Flanagan had moved faster than they'd let themselves believe. He had disappeared into the city's underbelly like a rat into the pipes. He was not dead, but he was dangerous. He had chosen to weaponize fear. The message ended with a single phrase that made Lily feel as if someone had put a fist into the hollow of her stomach. "You belong to us." She folded herself into the couch at the safe house, rain at the window, and pressed the folder to her chest. The ledgers were now more than paper. They were a decision, a line drawn that could not be easily erased. Dante sat beside her and did not speak for a long time. He held her hand in his, the warmth a small and stubborn fact in a universe that felt like it was tilting toward the unknown. "Tomorrow," he said, finally, "we go to the docks. We handle this. We make Flanagan visible." Lily looked at him. The man who had promised a shield would be with her when she had to face the thing she had fled. The ledger felt heavy and resolute between her fingers. Outside, the rain made the city lights blur into glassy love notes to weather. She imagined instead a different blur, roses in a garden, thorned and tended. She thought of Mrs. Corsetti's hands and the way they had signed the word for endurance. She thought for a strange second of a future where hands like hers might not have to measure danger, and the world could be something other than the ledger it had become. At dawn the next day, the safe house filled with the quiet preparations of people who understood that confrontation was both a ceremony and a business. The Corsetti cars were municipal in their anonymity, gray and measured. Dante moved with the kind of calm that only experience could buy. He kissed the side of her head before she climbed into the back seat, a contact brief as a benediction. "Come back to the garden," he signed to her, a small, odd invitation that made her heart stutter. It was not a promise of forever, merely a request for a place to land if they survived. They drove through the city that was waking up under rain. The docks smelled of salt and oil, and the petulant human smell of goods moved in the night. Crane lights painted the gray in hard, unromantic bars. Men in reflective vests were briefed in slow voices on the pens of the working day. The Corsetti cars parked at the edge of a concrete slab that had once known the sounds of loading and unloading, and now only the echo of footsteps. They moved toward the warehouse where Flanagan was said to be meeting an intermediary. Lily's palms were damp on the folder. She thought about the possibility of exposing her family and hated herself and loved herself in the same pulse. The plan was not violent in its intention. Make Flanagan's network transparent enough that the O'Malleys had to address him publicly.
It would be a humiliation in the way that violence sometimes is, administrative, shaming, a stripping of the tools he'd used to ascend. When they reached the warehouse, a man with a limp, someone Lily knew only by memory and by the scar that ran along his jaw, opened the door and looked at her as if he were studying a photograph of someone whose face belonged to the past. He shut the door behind them, and the smell of diesel and paper hung solemnly. Inside, the lights were low, the shadows moving like complacent things. Flanagan was not where they expected. Instead, there were voices, men speaking too much, and a table laid with bottles, and a single folder that seemed to be the center of an altar. Someone laughed too loud. Then the doors at the far end of the warehouse opened, and a figure she had not expected. Patrick O'Malley's silhouette filled the doorway like a headline. He was not the man she remembered from her childhood photographs. Age had softened some edges, while grief had etched others into permanent lines. He looked at Lily as if at the last thing he had been allowed to see in a long while. The room held its breath. Men who had been calculating numbers and alliances paused their conversations and watched as if a weather front had shifted. Lily's mouth went dry. She had not expected him to be there. She had expected to call his name across a ledger and get a measured answer. Instead, the man who had taught loyalty like catechism stood before her, shoulders sloped and eyes ringed with a weariness she had secretly feared. "You," he said, voice a low surprise that made her wonder if the word was a balm or a blade. She was not sure she could speak. The ledger was in her hand like a shard. She had 1,000 names and reasons and betrayals on her tongue. She had run, and living was, without permission at times, an act of defiance. She wanted to tell him that she had left, to save them from a life that would take them in ways that love could not ransom. She wanted to explain that counting napkins had been her way out. Instead, she folded her hands and signed a small greeting, more habitual than meaning. "Hello." His expression broke in a way she did not recognize. Patrick O'Malley, the boss who had taught his children to be measured like chess pieces, staggered back, and then the upholsterers of the room later said he had dropped to his knees, as if his legs could no longer hold the gravity of the news and the years. "Not again," he whispered, so low the men around him had to lean in, like listeners at a confession. The words landed in Lily's chest with the softness of a hand closing over a small animal. Not again. She had heard it like an echo in other houses. Not this way, not now. It could mean anger, it could mean exhaustion, it could mean that the world had demanded another of him, and he did not have the currency to pay. She braced for what would come next. Indignation, accusations, an order to be taken away. Instead, his mouth worked as if forming letters he had not practiced in years. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched the ledger in her grip as if it were fragile. Then he looked up at her, and in his eyes there was a fatigue that was less about age and more about regret. "Tell me," he said. His voice was small, child-raw. "Tell me everything." Lily had come prepared with ledgers and proof and a plan. She had not come prepared to be summoned to the knees of the man whose name still followed hers like a shadow. She tasted the iron of fear and a curious, trembling intimacy. She opened her mouth, and, for the first time in years, she began to speak not in fragments, but in whole sentences, laying out the ledger, the betrayals, the fear for her siblings. She told him of Flanagan's treachery, of the intercepted messages, of the photographs, and the hidden account numbers.
She told him of the nights she had slept with her hands clenched and of the small, stubborn life she wanted to lead that did not involve an address that carried weight. He listened without interruption, and when she finished, he drew a breath that sounded like someone who had been holding the ocean back. "Not again," he said again, but this time it sounded less like complaint and more like a benediction gone wrong. He touched the scar on his own hand, old habit, old history, and looked at her with the complexity of a man who had measured men for profit and had found in the balance something he could not account for, the price of a child's future. Lily waited for condemnation. Instead, he closed his eyes, and the men in the room shifted, as if part of them had to step back from a scene that was private. For a moment, the warehouse was not a place of business, but a chapel with low lights and the scent of oil and rain. The ledger lay between them like an accusation and a plea. He stood then, slowly, and the room held its own breath. He looked at Flanagan, who had appeared from the shadows like a dog who thought himself king, and in his face was the same tiredness Lily had seen in the photograph. A man who had done what he felt he had to, and now stood there waiting to be told what came next. "You're tired," Patrick said to Flanagan, in a voice that was both sentence and verdict. "You took a man's daughter into the wind. You made threats. You have no compass left but your greed." Flanagan's defense flickered. The men who had been his allies shifted their weight. In the balance of stare and ledger, decisions were made without blood. Men submit to humiliation when it is cheaper than death. Patrick's next move, spoken without drama, changed the room's ledger of loyalties. "You will leave," he said to Flanagan, the sentence simple as a legal decree. "You will be gone from our streets. You will not come back." Flanagan laughed once, short and brittle. "Do you think you can do that without?" Patrick cut him off with a look that had been earned in other winters. "I am not the man I was. I am done repeating the things I have done to keep this family breathing." The room did not explode. It rearranged. Men shifted allegiance like pieces repositioned on a board after a sudden rule change. Flanagan's exit was not cinematic. It was a slipping away, a man who disappeared into the city's margins with his pride bruised and his pockets slightly less full. The trade was practical, a quiet departure for information that made his enemies look like fools. When the men left and the warehouse's lamps hummed back into the ordinary, Patrick remained where he had stood. His knees were raw and his hands trembled. He looked at Lily as if trying to memorize a face he had lost in small increments. "Not again," he said once more, but there was no venom in it now. It read as grief, as a compass misplaced. Lily had thought she would leave the ledger and the negotiation and step back into anonymity. Instead, as the rain outside softened into a fine mist, Patrick reached for her hands. Not the commanding grasp of a boss, but the tentative touch of a man realizing he had missed the real calculations of his life. "You are my daughter," he said, and the words were both legal and tender. She could not decide if the relief that knotted through her body was guilt or something like salvation. The ledger lay in the middle of the stained wooden table, the pages soaked with decisions, but not with blood. Outside, the city kept moving. Cranes, lights, and the tired rumble of deliverance. He swallowed, then reached into his breast pocket and put something into her palm, a folded photograph she'd thought lost as a child, and beneath it a small scratched coin he had carried since youth. "For luck," he said, with a humor that nearly made her laugh, "and because you're stubborn."
She looked at him and then at Dante, who stood a few steps back with a steady, unreadable expression. The men around them had resumed the motions of measurement and exit. The ledger had done its work, in the way proof sometimes does. It rearranged priorities and revealed answers without force. Later, after the warehouse emptied and the rain drained into the gutters, Lily and Dante walked back to the car under a sky that tasted of salt. The leather seat in the back smelled like old cigarettes and the perfume of someone who knew how to command a family. Still, Dante signaled with his fingers a quiet congratulations, a small private exchange that felt like a promise. "We didn't make it worse," he signed. "We didn't lose them." She nodded. The ledger in her bag felt heavy still, but it had been used for something that might mean her siblings could sleep in the beds of strangers who were paid to keep their lids on. The city hummed, and the roses in the Corsetti garden, which Dante had told her to come back to, waited for her return, as if they were an emblem of a life that could be tended. Inside her pocket, against the fabric of her skirt, something shifted, and she felt the small, startling truth of it. New life, an answer she had not expected to be a part of the ledger or the negotiations. She pressed her fingers against the fabric as though feeling for a pulse. When she got home that night, she did not tell Dante. She sat in the dark of her kitchen and let the city's rain beat a rhythm against the window. The thought of telling her father had been unimagined and yet inevitable. She had left to keep them safe, and now the thing inside her was proof that some cycles refused to be broken neatly. She could say nothing, keep counting napkins, keep studying, and let the tide rise. Or she could let the new thing become another ledger line that demands protection and love. The weight of the revelation was not melodramatic. It was a small domestic terror. She thought of the photograph Patrick had given her, the coin in her palm, and felt the gravity of the moment. She thought of Dante in the car and his steady promise. She thought of Mrs. Corsetti's hands and the way they had signed endurance as if it were a currency worth bargaining with. The next morning, the city was a wet mirror. She made coffee and sat at the tiny kitchen table and considered all the ways a confession could be taken. Men like Patrick O'Malley measured the world in returns and risks. A child in the family ledger could be a blessing and a target. She could have kept the secret and let it sit like a quiet ember. Instead, she made her choice. She walked to the O'Malley house with the photograph and the ledger and the coin in her pocket, and a silence that felt like prayer. The door opened before she had finished the knock. Patrick was there in the doorway, wearing a sleep-worn cardigan and a look of someone who had not expected to be surprised again by the morning. When she told him, when the words fell out of her like small domestic stones, he folded in a way that was not wholly new and not wholly old. His body gave up the weight of manhood, and he sank to his knees, as if the old habit had been to carry everything alone, and suddenly the weight of the child was too much to be borne standing. "Not again," he whispered, and this time the whisper was not an order. It was a confession of fear and a hope that the ledger could be different if the family chose it. Lily watched him and saw, finally, the cost of the life she had walked away from, and the price of the one she might be carrying inside her. She had wanted, when she left, to be someone who did not ask for rescues. Now, in front of the man who had taught her to call loyalty a virtue, she realized rescue would be a shared thing, or not at all. Patrick looked up at her with hands that had once been used to decree and now were pleading. "Tell me," he said, hoarse with sudden humility, "tell me what you need." She folded her hands, the old language becoming new again. I need my brother's safe, she signed first, because some things must be made physically certain. Then, slowly, she let the rest come, words that meant both apology and promise. And I need to be able to keep this child from being counted as another debt. He studied her as if reading a contract, and then, in a movement that surprised them both, he rose, and, instead of giving an order, he placed his hand on her abdomen, as if feeling for the ledger's newest line. The gesture was clumsy and familiar and entirely human. Then we will make a different ledger, he said, whispering the same phrase Dante had once signed, the same kind of radical plan that involved care and restraint rather than profit and expansion. Outside, the rain steadied into a fine mist that glossed the city in the way new beginnings sometimes arrange themselves, tentative and wet, and smelling faintly of roses. Lily, whose life had been a ledger of survivals, felt for once that the numbers might add up to something other than arithmetic and fear. The real work, she knew, would come later, negotiations that were not about profit, arrangements that asked men used to counting bullets to count lullabies instead. But she also knew that a man like Patrick O'Malley going to his knees and whispering, "Not again," in her presence, had reorganized the world a little. It had made room for promises that had not been spoken aloud before. Dante found her later in the Corsetti garden, where the roses were still trimmed and patient. He reached for her hand, and this time there was no need for translating signs. His palm fit around hers as if around a small, tender secret. He did not ask what would come next. He only said softly, as if testing a future that might be real, "We will teach the child to sign." She laughed them, a sound that was small and honest. Under the garden lights, with rain blurring the city into watercolor, Lily allowed herself to imagine hands that spoke not of duty, but of lullabies, hands that would one day teach a small body how to trace letters in the air. The ledger had changed its ink. The life she had feared would be counted as a debt might instead become a currency of its own. They did not know how everything would resolve. There would be deals and apologies, reshufflings of power, and a retirement that would be quieter than history had expected. Flanagan slipped away into the city's margins like a bad memory that still stung. Patrick O'Malley announced his step back from the front lines with a press of hands and a strange, halting speech about making room. Dante stood at his side, and in the months that followed, the line between families blurred into negotiations and care. But in that moment, with the coin in her palm and the rain making the roses blush, Lily allowed herself to believe in one small thing, that sometimes confession rearranges the world in ways that calculation cannot predict. She placed her hand over Patrick's and felt the rhythm of his pulse, an old and human meter, and she signed to him the simplest of promises, "I will do my best." He smiled then, and the smile was a thing with a history and a future. "So will I," he whispered, and the warehouse's shadows, for once, made room for a tenderness they had not expected. They left the warehouse with fewer enemies than anticipated, and a strange new ally in daylight, one who had chosen to fold his power into protection rather than extraction. The city, gray and glistening, offered its own quiet absolution. But the ledger had not been closed. Decisions require labor, and the coming weeks would ask of them things that were less cinematic and more bureaucratic. Moves to secure safe houses, quiet negotiations to ensure Flanagan's disappearance was permanent, legal eyes that had to be diverted without turning the city's law against them. Dante and Lily would find themselves learning how to make agreements with men who measure loyalty like commodities,
and how to tender a family into a step back that would feel like surrender to those who had not known any other way. For now, though, there was a coin in Lily's palm, and the memory of Patrick O'Malley on his knees, whispering, "Not again." It was a confession, an admission of weariness and hope tangled into one breath. It was also, she realized, an acceptance that some cycles might be broken, not by running, but by staying and arguing, and by the stubborn, slow work of teaching hands to do new things.
She pensou do child que careada, dos small hands que one day need to learn a language of touch and sign. The city outside their window remained dangerous and unruly, but inside the small orbit of the Corsetti Barden, roses open to the rain like slow, courageous mouths. There would be a warehouse confrontation still to come, words to fix and promises to hold. But in the brief, luminous space after an old man's whisper, Lily let herself hope that the ledger could be rewritten in ink that held both mercy and an accounting of cost. She stood in the garden with Dante and Patrick, and for the first time in a long while, allowed the future to be something other than a tally of debts.